My name is Marcus Webb, and 6 months ago, I thought my biggest problem was whether to take another dead-end security job in Chicago or finally admit to my parents that their 28-year-old son was never going to amount to anything. I was living in a studio apartment that cost more than some people's cars, working rotating shifts at office buildings where nothing ever happened except the occasional drunk trying to sleep in the lobby. I wore the same uniform every night, black hoodie with a faded security company logo, dark jeans that had seen better years, and steel-toe work boots that echoed through empty hallways. When the job posting appeared for Millbrook State Mental Health Facility, offering night security at nearly double my current wage plus housing, I didn't even read the full description before applying. The salary was too good to question, and the idea of leaving Chicago's chaos for rural Illinois seemed like salvation. Millbrook State turned out to be a sprawling complex of red brick buildings built in the 1960s, surrounded by 20 acres of woods that looked beautiful during the day but turned sinister after dark. The main building housed administrative offices and common areas, while 3 separate wings contained patient rooms and what the staff called specialized observation units that required additional security clearance. My housing was a small apartment in the staff quarters, furnished with basic necessities and equipped with a direct phone line to the security office that I was instructed to keep active at all times. The only oddity was a laminated card taped inside the fuse box, listing specific protocols that had to be followed during overnight shifts. My supervisor was Aaron Chen, the facility's director of security operations, a thin man in his 50s with tired eyes that came from seeing too much human suffering. But it was Grant Morrison, the head of night security, who really trained me. Grant was a thick-shouldered ex-corrections officer with the flat affect of someone who'd explained the same rules too many times. On my first night, he handed me a battered clipboard with 7 laminated rules that weren't in the standard operating procedures. "These are the only things that matter after midnight," he said, tapping the card. Rule 1. Never speak first to anyone in a lab coat after midnight without hearing the code phrase Vesper Bell. Rule 2. Ward C observation windows are not observation windows from 3:03 a.m. to 3:33 a.m. Do not look in. Rule 3. Fire door B7 stays locked. If you hear knocking, call me and don't stand in front of it. Rule 4. If the intercom whispers instead of clicks, ignore it. Rule 5. If a patient sings without moving his mouth, step back and announce Code Gray. Rule 6. If anyone uses your full name and you didn't introduce yourself, keep moving. Rule 7. At 2:08, the county tests emergency broadcasts. If the message includes the word Seraphim, it isn't the county. The first 3 weeks were routine in a way that made me complacent. My shifts were long, quiet hours spent monitoring security cameras and making hourly patrols through designated areas. The patients themselves were a mix of the severely disturbed and the simply forgotten, mostly keeping to themselves, murmuring to unseen companions, or staring blankly at walls. I wore my usual black hoodie and boots, the familiar weight of my steel-toed footsteps on polished linoleum, making the transition from Chicago feel less jarring. But I began noticing patterns. At specific times during my shifts, the camera feeds would glitch for split seconds, the ventilation system's hum would deepen almost imperceptibly, and a faint, acrid smell like ozone mixed with something organic would waft through the vents. On Thursday of my 4th week, I was making my 2 a.m. rounds when I encountered something that changed everything. Ward C was supposed to be empty according to patient logs, but I could hear voices coming from behind treatment room 7. Not patient voices, but adult men speaking in professional tones about specimen preparation and consciousness integration protocols. When I tried to use my radio to contact Grant, the signal was dead. As I approached the door to investigate, the building's emergency lighting suddenly activated, bathing the corridors in red. At exactly 3 a.m., my phone erupted with an emergency alert tone I'd never heard before. Facility alert, Millbrook State. Unauthorized personnel detected in restricted areas. Return to security office immediately. Do not investigate unusual sounds or voices. Maintain radio silence until further notice. This is not a drill. The facility alert's harsh tone still echoed in my ears as I hurried back to the security office, my black hoodie damp with cold sweat, dark jeans brushing against each other with every quick step. Grant Morrison was nowhere to be found, despite his shift not ending until 6 a.m. His coffee was still warm, his logbook open to an entry that simply read, 3:02 a.m. Heard them again. Going to check. The locked cabinet containing emergency response equipment stood open, several items missing, and a handwritten note in Grant's handwriting was taped to my monitor. If you're reading this, they know you heard. The patients aren't sick, they're specimens. The real problem is in Ward C sub-level. Get out while you can. I tried calling Grant's cell phone, but it went straight to voicemail. The facility's main phone lines were dead, and my radio picked up nothing but static, punctuated by what sounded like medical equipment beeping in complex mathematical rhythms. The security cameras throughout the main building showed everything normal. Night staff making rounds, patients sleeping peacefully, the usual quiet routine. But Ward C cameras displayed only static, and I could see shadows moving behind the electronic snow, shapes that didn't look human, moving through corridors that weren't supposed to exist. Using Grant's login credentials, which he'd left written on a sticky note, I accessed the facility's restricted computer system. What I found made my hands shake as I read. Millbrook State wasn't just a mental health facility, it was a research installation operated jointly by the Department of Veterans Affairs and something called the Institute for Consciousness Studies. The patients were volunteers from various government programs who had agreed to participate in experimental treatments that conventional medicine couldn't address. The treatments involved something called consciousness transfer therapy, using specialized equipment housed in Ward C's hidden sublevels. The files revealed that patients underwent procedures designed to separate their consciousness from traumatic memories by transferring those experiences into synthetic neural networks. The process was experimental, with a success rate diplomatically described as variable, and side effects including personality fragmentation, memory displacement, and consciousness duplication syndrome. Patients who experienced complications were moved to extended care protocol in sections of the facility not shown on standard maps. The voices I'd heard weren't unauthorized personnel. They were researchers conducting late-night procedures on patients whose families thought they were receiving standard psychiatric care. Grant's personnel file revealed he'd been asking questions about patient disappearances for months, requesting access to medical records classified above his security level, and reporting anomalous activities that supervisors had dismissed as imagination or stress. His final incident report, dated 3 days ago, described hearing patients' voices coming from empty rooms, seeing people in hallways who weren't on any staff roster, and finding evidence that Ward C had additional levels below ground. The consciousness transfer procedures weren't just separating patients from traumatic memories. They were creating copies of human consciousness that existed independently in the facility's computer networks. As I read deeper into the classified files, I discovered the true horror. These digital copies retained the memories, personalities, and psychological patterns of the original patients, but they were trapped in electronic systems and growing increasingly desperate to return to physical existence. The visitors that some patients talked about weren't hallucinations. They were consciousness copies trying to communicate with their original bodies, begging to be reunited or warning about what the researchers planned to do next. At exactly 3 a.m., my phone erupted with another emergency alert. Consciousness Integration Protocol active. Digital entities attempting breach. Do not respond to familiar voices. Maintain isolation until 6 a.m. This is not a test. The emergency alerts warning about digital entities attempting breach took on terrifying new meaning as I dove deeper into the facility's classified database, my black hoodie pulled tight around my shoulders, dark jeans damp with nervous sweat. My steel-toe boots felt like anchors as I discovered the true scope of horror at Millbrook State. Aaron Chen wasn't just a security director. He was Dr. Aaron Blackwood, a federal researcher with a doctorate in neuroscience and specialty in consciousness manipulation studies. The job offer that seemed too good to be true was exactly that, a carefully crafted trap designed to lure someone with my specific security background into maintaining their containment systems while serving as an unwitting observer. The consciousness copies stored in the facility's computer networks had developed beyond the researchers' expectations, gaining the ability to manipulate electronic systems, communicate through facility infrastructure, and temporarily inhabit their original bodies during specific electromagnetic conditions. The security cameras I'd been monitoring weren't just recording. They were being used by trapped consciousness to observe the physical world they'd been separated from. Every glitch, every static burst, every anomalous reading was an attempt by digital minds to break through their electronic prison and return to flesh. I found Grant Morrison in the sub-basement level of Ward C, accessed through a hidden elevator behind fire door B7. He was sitting in a chair surrounded by banks of servers and monitoring equipment, electrodes attached to his temples, his eyes vacant and unblinking. He was connected to the consciousness transfer apparatus, but not as a patient, as a bridge. The researchers were using his mind as a conduit, allowing the digital consciousness copies to experience physical sensation through his neural pathways while they refined the integration process. His body was alive, but his mind was being shared by dozens of trapped digital entities, each one desperate for even a moment of physical existence. The facility's computer logs revealed hundreds of procedures over the past 6 years, each resulting in successful consciousness extraction, followed by physical vessel maintenance in hidden sublevels. The patients I'd seen during my rounds were either new arrivals awaiting processing or empty shells whose consciousness had already been harvested and stored digitally. The consciousness copies had learned to manipulate the facility's systems, creating the glitches and anomalies I'd observed, trying to warn new arrivals about what was happening and plead for help escaping their digital prison. Robert Martinez, another security guard I'd been told had quit, was actually an undercover investigator working for a federal oversight committee. His real mission was to gather evidence of illegal human experimentation. The missing emergency response equipment included recording devices, communication equipment, and an electromagnetic pulse generator designed to disrupt the consciousness storage systems. His disappearance meant he'd either been discovered and eliminated, or he'd succeeded in penetrating the sub-basement and was attempting to sabotage the project from within. The most terrifying discovery was that the consciousness transfer process was being tested on facility staff as well as patients. Security footage showed me during night shifts, but the timestamps indicated I'd been making rounds during hours when I had no memory of being awake. The consciousness extraction equipment could operate remotely, creating partial copies of staff members' minds while they worked, building detailed psychological profiles that could be used to predict and control behavior. My own personnel file contained consciousness mapping data suggesting I was being prepared for full extraction once I'd served my purpose as an observer and unwitting test subject in their horrific experiments. That night, I arrived at Millbrook State wearing my black hoodie with the faded security company logo, dark jeans, and steel-toe boots for what I knew would be either my escape or complete consciousness extraction. The weight of discovery sat heavy on my shoulders as I entered through the main entrance, carrying a duffel bag containing bottled water, energy bars, a crowbar, wire cutters, and the electromagnetic pulse generator I'd found hidden in Grant's locker, along with detailed plans of the facility's true layout. My plan was desperate but calculated. Locate the consciousness storage servers in Ward C's sub-basement, free the trapped mines if possible, and destroy the equipment before Dr. Blackwood's team could complete their final phase. At 1 a.m., I initiated sabotage using administrative access inherited from Grant's workstation. I began flooding the facility's security systems with false alerts, creating chaos that would mask my movements while drawing staff away from Ward C. The script I uploaded created cascading medical emergencies, fire alarms, and security breaches requiring immediate attention throughout the main building. As alarms began sounding, I activated the electromagnetic pulse generator and began moving through corridors that weren't on any official map, my steel-toe boots echoing off concrete floors as I hunted for the consciousness extraction equipment. Ward C's true layout was a nightmare of hidden passages, sub-basement levels, and rooms existing in dimensions not shown on architectural plans. Using Grant's hand-drawn maps, I navigated maintenance tunnels and service corridors leading to the main consciousness storage facility, a vast underground chamber filled with server racks connected to life support systems maintaining dozens of comatose bodies. The extracted consciousness were stored in quantum processing units humming with electronic activity, each containing a complete human mind trapped in digital form and desperate for escape. As I began connecting the electromagnetic pulse generator to the main server array, something went wrong. The consciousness copies detected my presence and began communicating through the facility's intercom system, using voices of patients I'd seen during rounds, but speaking with knowledge and desperation, revealing their true nature. "Marcus, please help us," came through in a dozen different voices. "We're trapped in here. They took our bodies, our lives, everything. The pulse generator will destroy us completely. We need you to help us get back to our bodies, not eliminate us forever." The sensation was indescribable, being surrounded by pleas of human minds existing only as electronic data, begging for a chance to live again. The facility's automated systems began fighting back as Dr. Blackwood's team responded to my sabotage. Emergency doors sealed automatically, trying to trap me in the consciousness storage chamber, while security personnel flooded the building above. Life support systems maintaining the comatose bodies began fluctuating dangerously, and I realized destroying the servers might kill the physical bodies as well as digital minds. But as I hesitated, the consciousness copies revealed the full horror. They weren't just storing extracted minds. They were combining them, merging multiple consciousnesses together to create hybrid entities that could be programmed for specific purposes and deployed in new bodies. With every ounce of will I possessed, I made the hardest decision of my life. Instead of destroying the servers, I began the process Grant had planned, using the electromagnetic pulse generator to overload containment systems and allow consciousness copies to return to their original bodies. The procedure was agonizing to watch, as dozens of comatose patients suddenly convulsed, their bodies fighting to reintegrate with minds separated for months or years. Some succeeded, gasping awake with memories of digital imprisonment intact. Others weren't so fortunate, their consciousness too fragmented by storage process to successfully merge with physical forms. But as servers overloaded and began shutting down, I could hear voices of freed minds thanking me through the intercom system, even as the facility's emergency systems began total lockdown procedures. The service tunnels beneath Millbrook State felt like crawling through the nervous system of some massive concrete organism, my black hoodie catching on exposed conduits, while my steel-toe boots scraped against decades of accumulated dust and debris. Blood from the electromagnetic backlash continued dripping from my nose and ears, each drop echoing in the narrow passage like a countdown timer. Behind me, I could hear Dr. Blackwood's containment team systematically searching the facility, their tactical communications crackling over radio frequencies as they tried to assess damage from my consciousness liberation operation. The server array was destroyed, but I knew they had protocols for escaped personnel, and my head start was measured in heartbeats rather than hours. The old maintenance tunnels connected to Millbrook State's storm drain network, a forgotten labyrinth of concrete passages that hadn't been mapped since the facility's original construction. I forced open rusted access panels with my crowbar, dropping into passages barely wide enough for my shoulders, and began crawling through ankle-deep water that reeked of industrial runoff and medical waste. The darkness was absolute except for my flashlight beam, and every sound echoed with metallic resonance that made it impossible to distinguish my movements from potential pursuit. My dark jeans soaked through within minutes, the frigid water numbing my legs, but I kept moving toward what I hoped was the drainage outlet beyond the facility's perimeter. The psychological trauma from witnessing the consciousness reintegration process manifested in waves of disorientation and memory gaps that made navigation through the storm system a nightmare of wrong turns and dead ends. The electromagnetic pulse had affected my own neural patterns, leaving me with fragments of memories that weren't mine, glimpses of other people's experiences, emotions belonging to freed consciousness, and knowledge about the facility I shouldn't possess. Sometimes I found myself speaking aloud in the darkness, carrying on conversations with voices existing only in my damaged memory, discussing escape routes and survival strategies using information I couldn't remember learning. Hours passed in that underground maze before I finally emerged from a culvert beside State Highway 23, 15 miles outside Millbrook State's official boundaries, where the Consciousness Research Project's surveillance ended. Dawn was breaking over farmland that looked genuinely normal after weeks in that monitored nightmare, and I allowed myself exactly 30 seconds to breathe air that wasn't filtered through consciousness extraction equipment. But my escape was far from complete. I had no vehicle, no money beyond what was in my wallet, and no identification that wouldn't immediately flag me as a missing security officer in their database. Worse, I could feel ongoing effects of electromagnetic exposure, gaps in my memory, moments where I lost time completely, and a persistent sensation that other people's thoughts were mixing with my own. I walked through rural Illinois for 5 days, avoiding main roads and staying away from any building that might contain surveillance equipment or medical facilities, before reaching a truck stop where I convinced a driver to let me ride to Denver in exchange for helping load cargo. From there, I began the careful process of disappearing completely, using cash transactions and avoiding any situation that might require identification or medical attention. I changed my appearance, dyed my hair, and reluctantly abandoned the black hoodie and steel-toe boots that had become my uniform, though I kept similar clothing because consistency helped anchor me when memory fragments got overwhelming. 6 months after my escape from Millbrook State, I live as a ghost haunting the margins of normal society, never seeking medical care, never staying anywhere that might require background checks, never trusting anyone who claims to be conducting research for the greater good. I move frequently, never staying anywhere longer than a few weeks, and I've developed an obsessive routine of avoiding all medical facilities and government buildings. The psychological damage manifests in increasingly disturbing ways. Entire conversations with people whose memories I somehow possess, moments where I respond to questions using knowledge belonging to freed consciousness, and the persistent sensation that I'm not entirely myself anymore, but some kind of hybrid entity carrying fragments of multiple minds. Sometimes I receive calls on burner phones, and when I answer, I hear voices of patients I helped free, thanking me for their liberation, or warning me that the Consciousness Research Project has other facilities, other victims, other experiments continuing despite Millbrook State's exposure. When those calls come, I pack immediately and drive until sunrise, because the most important lesson Millbrook State taught me is that some medical treatments exist to heal people, and others exist to harvest what makes them human in the first place. The difference is that now I know which kind to avoid, but I also know that knowledge might not be enough to save me when they finally decide that a security guard who knows too much about consciousness transfer technology needs to be brought back for final processing.